At about 4 o'clock in the morning on the 16th of June, 1943, a single American bomber lifted off from a muddy airstrip in New Guinea and turned out over the Black Ocean, alone. There was no formation forming up around it in the dark. There were no escort fighters climbing up to join it, and there would be none for the whole of the long day ahead. It was one single aircraft, flying 600 miles across open water, alone, toward one of the most heavily defended islands in the entire South Pacific. Every man aboard understood that if anything went wrong out there, no one was coming with them, and no one was coming for them. The airplane was a B-17 Flying Fortress, and it had a number painted on its tail that ended in 3 sixes, so the crew called it Old 666. The mission was not to bomb anything, and that is the first strange thing about it. A bomber's whole purpose is to carry bombs to a target, and this one carried none. It was to take photographs, to map the beaches of an island called Bougainville for an invasion still months away. And to do that, the bomber would have to fly in a perfectly straight line, perfectly level, for 22 minutes over enemy territory. It could not turn, it could not climb away, it could not do any of the things a pilot does to stay alive when the fighters come. Before that morning was over, the front of that bomber would be blown apart by cannon fire. More than 200 bullet holes would be punched through its body. 6 of the 9 men aboard would be wounded, and one of them would be dead at his gun. The crew would claim 7 Japanese fighters shot down, and we will be honest about that number when we get to it. And they would bring the photographs home, the photographs that would save the lives of thousands of men who waded onto that beach 5 months later. This is the story of the most decorated flight in the history of American aviation, and of why the crew of that lone bomber refused, deliberately, to do the one thing that could have saved all their lives. It is worth saying at the outset what this story is not, because the version of it that circulates online has been stretched into something it never was. It is not the tale of a lone ace gunning down a squadron. It is the tale of 9 men in one airplane, and of the particular, quiet, almost unbearable kind of courage that has nothing to do with attacking and everything to do with holding still. The number of enemy fighters this crew shot down has been inflated in the retelling, sometimes wildly, and the truth is both smaller and larger than the legend. Smaller because the real count was modest. Larger because what these men actually did was harder than shooting down airplanes. To understand what these men did, you first have to understand the impossible shape of the job they had been given, because it was a job designed, almost perfectly, to get an aircrew killed. By the middle of 1943, the Allied advance through the South Pacific had reached a point where the next great objective was the island of Bougainville in the northern Solomons. It was big, it was mountainous, it was covered in jungle, and it was thick with Japanese airfields and troops. The Allies intended to land there in the autumn, and to land there they needed to know the ground. And above all, they needed to know the water, the reefs and shoals, and gradients of the beaches where the landing craft would have to come in. A landing craft that grounds on an unseen reef, hundreds of yards from shore, turns the men inside it into targets, and the planners had learned at other islands what that cost. They had learned it at a place called Tarawa, only months before, where a misjudged reef had forced Marines to wade hundreds of yards through machine gun fire, and had turned a small island into one of the bloodiest days the Marine Corps had ever known. The lesson of that reef was fresh and raw in the minds of the men planning the next landings. You did not send men against a beach you had not surveyed. You did not guess at the water. And so, for Bougainville, someone was going to have to go and photograph that water in detail from the air, long before the landing craft ever set out. There was only one way to get that information in 1943, and it was photography from the air. Not snapshots, but precise, overlapping, high-altitude photographs taken with special cameras, the kind that could be assembled into accurate maps a landing force could trust. And there was only one practical way to take those photographs over an island 600 miles inside enemy territory, which was to send a single aircraft alone to fly across it and film it. A single aircraft, because a formation would be spotted from a great distance and would bring up every fighter on the island. One lone bomber, high up, might slip in and out before the enemy could react, or so the theory went. The theory had a flaw, and everyone who flew these missions knew it. A single unescorted bomber, deep over enemy territory, with no friendly fighters anywhere near, was utterly on its own. If it was found, it would have to fight alone against however many fighters the enemy chose to send, with no help and no way home except to fly the whole distance back through the same hostile sky. Reconnaissance crews lived with that knowledge on every flight. They were, in a real sense, sent out to be either invisible or dead, and there was often very little in between. But that lone bomber came with a terrible condition attached, and the condition is the whole heart of this story. To take mapping photographs, you cannot maneuver. The cameras need a steady, straight, level platform, because the images have to overlap in a precise geometric pattern to be assembled into a map, and the slightest turn or climb or dive blurs them and tears a hole in the coverage. For this mission, the straight and level run over Bougainville would last 22 minutes. 22 minutes of flying in a rigid, predictable line, at a constant height and speed, over hostile ground, while unable to deviate by a single degree. Think about what that means for a bomber crew. Everything a pilot does to survive a fighter attack, he was forbidden to do. He could not corkscrew away. He could not dive for the deck and run. He could not turn into the attack or break away from it. He had to sit there, holding a ruler straight line through the sky, and let the enemy come to him and take it and keep flying straight. The instant he turned to save his aircraft, he would ruin the photographs and betray the men who would land on that beach in the autumn. The mission was, in the most literal sense, a decision to give up every defense a bomber has on purpose for 22 minutes over the enemy's front yard. But the ordeal of old 666 did not begin over Bougainville. It begins with a pilot the army did not quite know what to do with, and a wreck of an airplane that nobody else wanted to fly. The pilot was a young captain named Jay Zeamer. He was intelligent, he was brave, and by the ordinary measures of the Army Air Forces, he was something of a problem. He had gone to a fine engineering school before the war, and had a sharp, restless, technical mind, the kind that questions why things are done a certain way, which is a wonderful quality in an inventor, and an awkward one in a young officer expected to conform. He had trouble, early on, qualifying as a first pilot on the B-17. He kept failing check rides, the tests that certified a man to command the aircraft, and for a long stretch he was stuck flying as a co-pilot and filling odd jobs, a capable officer that the system did not know where to put. He was not banned, and he was not disgraced. He was simply underused, a man whose talents did not fit the boxes the army had drawn. There is an irony in that worth pausing on, because the man the system could not place would end up flying the single most decorated mission of the war. The qualities that made Zeamer awkward for the peacetime-style machinery of the army, a certain independence, a refusal to do things the standard way, a willingness to take a problem into his own hands, were exactly the qualities that this mission would demand. The army had a slot for a by-the-book first pilot, and Zeamer did not fit it. It did not yet have a slot for a man who would rebuild a wrecked bomber, arm it past all regulation, and fly it straight and level through a swarm of fighters because the photographs mattered more than his life. That slot he would carve for himself. His closest friend was a bombardier named Joseph Sarnoski, a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania, one of a large family, a gentle and well-liked man who happened to be one of the finest bombardiers in the theatre. He had come up the hard way, out of the coal country, in a big family that did not have much, and he had made himself into a skilled specialist through nothing but work. The two of them, the restless engineer and the coal miner's son, made an unlikely pair, and they became close enough that when they went looking for a way into the fight, they went looking together. The two of them wanted to fly and fight, and they were not getting the chance, and so they did something about it in the most direct way available. They went looking for an airplane, and they found one nobody wanted. This is the part of the story that says the most about who these men were. Faced with an army that had no clear role for them, they did not sit and wait for orders. They found a broken machine and a group of men in the same situation as themselves, and they built their own way into the war. There is something deeply American about it, in the best sense, a refusal to accept that the official system's judgment of you is the final word, and a willingness to pick up the discarded thing and make it into something formidable with your own hands. The eager beavers were, in the most literal way, a crew that made itself. It was a B-17E that had been worn out and written off, a hangar queen, damaged and stripped and left to rot at the edge of the field, considered not worth repairing. It had been shot up on an earlier mission and passed from unit to unit, and by the time it reached them, it had a reputation as a hard-luck airplane that other crews were happy to avoid. Zeamer and Sarnoski claimed it anyway, and around it they gathered a crew of men very much like themselves, men that other captains were happy to be rid of, oddballs and misfits and troublemakers, and together this collection of rejects went to work rebuilding a discarded bomber with their own hands. They earned a nickname doing it, the Eager Beavers, because there was no job and no mission they would not take on. The name was half a joke and half a description, given to a crew that kept raising its hand for the work everyone else hoped to avoid, and they wore it with a certain pride. They did not just repair the airplane, they rebuilt it into something more dangerous than it had ever been. A standard B-17 of that period carried around 13 machine guns. Zeamer's crew crammed in far more, something on the order of 1950 caliber guns, packing extra weapons wherever a man could fire one until the aircraft bristled. Zeamer even had a fixed 50 caliber machine gun mounted so that he, the pilot, could fire it straight ahead, turning the heavy bomber for a moment into something like a fighter. Out of a wreck that nobody wanted, the Misfits had built what may have been the most heavily armed B-17 in the Pacific. The exact number of guns they crammed aboard is one of those details the sources argue over, some saying 16, some 19. And the disagreement is itself a sign of how far past the normal standard they went. What is certain is that they added guns wherever a gun could physically be fired, and that they thought hard about the angles from which a lone bomber could be attacked, and tried to close every one of them. They knew that an unescorted aircraft would have to be its own escort, and they built accordingly. The fixed forward gun that Zeamer could fire himself was the clearest expression of the idea. A heavy bomber given a fighter's sting in the nose, so that an enemy coming head-on would not find the front of the aircraft defenseless. They flew it hard, and they flew it in ways that were not in any manual. On one mission, Zeamer took the heavy bomber down low and used it like a strafing fighter against enemy positions, brushing the rooftops, an almost unheard-of way to fly a flying fortress. On another, they were caught in searchlights at night, and rather than run, bombed the lights themselves under heavy fire. They skip-bombed enemy shipping, flinging their bombs across the surface of the water, the way a boy skips a stone across a pond. Everything about the way they operated said the same thing, that this was a crew that treated a heavy bomber not as a lumbering target to be nursed home, but as a weapon to be fought aggressively. And that took risks other crews would not. They flew it hard. In the months before this mission, they volunteered for the dangerous jobs, the lone reconnaissance flights and the risky strikes, and they built a reputation for coming back from things they should not have come back from. Zeamer had already earned a decoration for using this heavy bomber like a fighter, diving on enemy anti-aircraft positions to strafe them so that other bombers could get through. This was a crew that went looking for the hard missions, in an airplane they had raised from the dead, and in June of 1943, the hardest one of all came looking for them. The assignment was the Bougainville mapping run, 600 miles out, alone. The 22-minute straight line over a defended island. That was already close to a suicide mission by the ordinary arithmetic of the air war. And then, late on the night before they flew, it got worse. At around 10 o'clock that night, with takeoff only hours away, the telephone rang, and it was an operations officer with a change to the plan. Naval intelligence had picked up signs of increased activity at a Japanese airfield on the small island of Buka, just off the northern tip of Bougainville, the kind of activity that suggested the enemy was building up strength there, and that command wanted eyes on it. Before making the mapping run, the crew was now asked to swing north over Buka and photograph that airfield too. It was a reasonable request from an intelligence standpoint, and it was a dreadful one from the standpoint of anybody who had to fly it, because flying over an active fighter airfield in daylight is the surest way in the world to wake up every fighter on it. Zeamer understood exactly what it meant, and twice before takeoff he pushed back against the Buka order. The mapping run over Bougainville, he argued, was dangerous enough on its own, and flying over Buka first would alert the enemy and send fighters into the air before the crucial photographs of the invasion beaches had even been taken. It was the reasoning of a man who had thought carefully about the whole shape of the mission and understood which part of it actually mattered. The Buka photographs were useful. The Bougainville beach photographs were the reason men would live or die. He was not trying to dodge danger. He was trying to make sure the danger bought the right thing. He was not refusing to do his duty. He was trying to protect the part of the mission that would actually save lives, the beach photographs, from being wrecked by an errand that would stir up the hornets first. He was overruled on the point, and the Buka question would be left to be settled in the air. And so, with a Misfit crew, a resurrected bomber, and a mission that had just been made close to impossible, they waited on a dark airstrip for 4 in the morning. There is a particular loneliness to the kind of flight old 666 began that morning, and it is worth trying to feel it. A bomber in a great formation is surrounded by hundreds of friends, by the guns of 100 other aircraft, by the sense, however false, of safety in numbers. This bomber had none of that. It flew into the dark entirely by itself, one set of engines droning over an empty ocean, with the nearest friendly aircraft hundreds of miles behind it and falling further behind with every minute. The men aboard were as alone as it is possible to be while still on the same planet as other human beings. Old 666 lifted off at 4 in the morning and flew out into the dark over the ocean, climbing slowly, heavy with fuel for the long haul, and with all those extra guns and all that ammunition. For hours there was nothing but the drone of the 4 engines and the black sea below, and the slow lightening of the sky ahead, and the knowledge sitting heavy in every man's stomach through the whole long crossing of exactly what waited at the end of the flight. The B-17 itself deserves a word here, because the airplane is part of why any of this was survivable at all. The flying fortress had earned its name honestly. It was a big, tough, four-engined machine, famous among the men who flew it for absorbing punishment that should have destroyed it, and staying in the air, coming home with engines shot out, with great holes torn in its wings and fuselage, with control cables hanging by threads. Crews trusted it the way you trust something that has saved your life before. Old 66 would test that toughness past almost anything on record, and the airframe would hold, which is the only reason there is a story to tell rather than a wreck on the ocean floor and 9 names on a list. The long flight out gave every man aboard hours to think, which is its own kind of ordeal. There was nothing to do but hold formation with an empty sky, watch the fuel, scan for the first sign of the enemy, and wait. 600 miles of open ocean is a very long way to fly toward something you have every reason to fear, and there is no distraction in it, only the steady drone of the engines and the slow arrival of the thing you are flying toward. Whatever these men felt in those hours, they kept flying, straight toward the island that was waiting for them. They reached the target area before the sun was high enough for the cameras to work, and that created the decision that shaped everything after. The light was not yet good enough to photograph the Bougainville beaches. They could circle and wait for the sun to climb, loitering over hostile water and risking being spotted. Or they could use the time to go north and get the Buka airfield photographs after all. Zeamer, whatever his objections the night before, put it to the crew because that was the kind of commander he was, a man who let his men vote on the decisions that might kill them. The eager beavers voted to go north to Buka. It was in character. They always took the harder job. It is worth sitting with that vote for a moment, because it is easy to pass over, and it should not be. These were not men being ordered to their deaths by someone far away and safe. They were being asked by their own commander, in the air, over the target, which of 2 dangerous things to do, and they chose the more dangerous one with their own voices. Every man in that airplane had a say, and together they voted to fly over an active enemy fighter field and photograph it, knowing exactly what that would stir up. They chose the harder job not because anyone made them, but because that was who they had decided to be. So they flew up over Buka airfield and photographed it. The photographs of that airfield had their own value to intelligence, and getting them was not a wasted effort, whatever it cost. But the cost was about to be enormous. As they made that run, the crew looked down and saw the thing they had dreaded. Japanese fighters were taking off. Not a few. The photographs from that run would later show the enemy fighters lining up and climbing away to intercept them, and the crew counted something like 17 or 20 of them rising into the air. What none of them knew, what Allied intelligence itself did not know, was that the Japanese had just days earlier moved hundreds of additional fighter aircraft into the Solomons. Old 666 had flown alone into a sky that had quietly become far more crowded and far more deadly than anyone at headquarters realized. That detail is one of the quiet horrors of the story. The men who planned this mission believed they understood the risk, and they had underestimated it badly through no fault of their own, because the enemy had reinforced the area only days before, and the information had not reached them. Old 666 was flying into a trap that was worse than the one everyone thought they were sending it into. The crew had accepted a mission they believed was nearly suicidal, and the reality was more dangerous still, and they had no way of knowing it until they saw the sky filling with fighters below them. Zeamer turned the bomber south, toward Bougainville and the mapping run, with the enemy fighters climbing behind him. And here is the moment that defines the whole mission, the choice that everything else hangs on. He had the Buka photographs already. He could have run for home right then, and the flight would not have been a total loss. But the beach photographs, the ones the invasion actually needed, had not been taken yet. Somewhere down south in a few months, thousands of Marines and soldiers were going to wade onto those beaches, and if old 666 turned for home now, they would do it blind, not knowing where the reefs lay that could strand their landing craft under fire. So Zeamer did not turn for home. He turned onto the mapping run, straight and level, and began the 22 minutes with a swarm of fighters climbing to catch him. That is where the first half of this story ends, with a lone bomber committing itself to a straight line it could not leave, and the enemy climbing to meet it. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the popular version of this mission inflates the number of enemy fighters shot down and turns a crew of 9 into a lone hero. The truth about what these men did together is better than the legend. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more. Thank you. Hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the head-on pass that destroyed the nose of the bomber, the dying man who crawled back to his gun, and the honest count of what this crew actually shot down. Do not go anywhere. The fighters caught up with old 666 near the end of the mapping run, and the timing could not have been crueler, because it meant the bomber was locked into its straight and level line at the exact moment it most needed to be able to move. The cameras were rolling, the photographs were being taken, and to keep taking them, Zeamer had to hold that rigid, predictable course through the sky, while the enemy positioned themselves to kill him. Try to hold both halves of that in your mind at once, because the whole meaning of the mission lives in the tension between them. On one side, a swarm of enemy fighters climbing and circling and lining up their attacks, choosing their angles at leisure against a target that would not, could not, move. On the other side, a wounded process that had to continue, a camera clicking away frame by overlapping frame, recording the reefs and the beaches, and a pilot who had to keep the airplane flying arrow straight so that those frames would knit together into a usable map. The bomber's survival pulled one way, the mission pulled the other, and Zeamer chose the mission, second by second, for as long as it took. The first attack came from the front. A group of about 5 fighters pulled ahead of the bomber, swung around, and came at it head-on, the most dangerous angle of attack against a B-17, and the one that would take them straight through the nose, where the bombardier sat. In that nose was Joseph Sarnoski, at his guns, and beside the whole problem sat Zeamer at the controls with his fixed forward-firing 50 caliber gun. As the range closed, everyone opened fire at once. The fighters' cannon and machine guns against the bomber's nose guns and Zeamer's fixed gun, a head-on collision of gunfire at hundreds of miles an hour of closing speed. The gunners of old 666 did what the mission allowed them to do, which was the only thing left, which was to shoot. If the airplane could not evade, then its guns would have to be its whole defense, and this was the airplane the eager beavers had built precisely for this, bristling with more weapons than any regulation called for. From the nose, from the top, from the sides and the belly and the tail, the bomber threw out a volume of fire that a normal B-17 could not have matched. It was the reason a single aircraft, forbidden to maneuver, was not simply destroyed in the first 30 seconds. In that first pass, the crew hit back hard. Zeamer fired his nose gun, and Sarnoski fired his, and Japanese fighters were hit, and here we arrive at the number in the title, and the promise to be honest about it. The crew of old 666 was credited with 7 enemy fighters shot down over the course of the battle, and 7 is the figure that has come down through the decades. But air combat claims were inflated on every side of the war, by honest men in the chaos of a fight who genuinely believed they had seen an enemy go down, when the enemy had only dived away. The true number confirmed destroyed was certainly lower. What is not in doubt is that this single bomber, forbidden to maneuver, fought off a swarm of fighters and destroyed several of them, and that it did so at a cost that makes the exact tally almost beside the point. This is the same caution we have applied to other battles on this channel, and it is worth being consistent about it. The famous kill ratios of the air war, the stories of one aircraft downing 7 or 10 or a dozen enemies, almost always shrink under close examination. A pilot who sees an enemy trailing smoke and falling away naturally records it as destroyed, when very often the enemy levelled out and flew home. This is not dishonesty. It is the fog of a violent, fast, terrifying event seen through a gun sight. So when we say the crew was credited with 7, we mean exactly that, credited, and the honest historian's estimate of the confirmed total is smaller. The point of this story was never the scoreboard. It was the straight line, because in that same first pass, the cost arrived. The 20mm cannon was the weapon that made the head-on attack so deadly, and it is worth understanding why. A machine gun bullet punches a clean hole. A 20mm shell is a small explosive projectile that detonates on impact, throwing fragments in every direction, and a single one bursting inside the thin-skinned nose of a bomber could do the work of dozens of bullets. The fighters coming at old 666 head-on were firing these, and the nose of a B-17, that greenhouse of glass where the bombardier and the navigator worked, was the most fragile and exposed part of the entire aircraft. A 20mm cannon shell, fired from one of the fighters coming head-on, struck the nose of old 666 and exploded. The nose of a B-17 is a greenhouse of plexiglass, a bubble of glass and light framing where the bombardier and navigator worked, and under the blast it disintegrated, filling the compartment with fragments and the sudden roar of the wind. The blast tore through the compartment where Sarnoski was fighting his guns and hurled him backward, out of his position, with a terrible wound in his abdomen. Fragments of the same storm of shellfire ripped into the cockpit, and Zeamer was hit badly, wounded in the arms and legs. His controls shot up. The instrument panel shattered in front of him. In a single instant, the two men at the front of the airplane, the pilot and the bombardier, were both grievously wounded, and the front of the bomber was a wrecked and open ruin with the wind screaming through it. Sarnoski was down, and he was dying, and he knew what the wound in his stomach meant. There is no surviving that kind of wound in the back of a bomber, hours from any hospital, and a bombardier who had studied enough of war knew it. He had, by a cruel turn, been due to rotate home within days. His war was almost over. He could have lain where the blast had thrown him, and no one would ever have said a word against him for it. Instead, he crawled back to his gun. Wounded through the abdomen, bleeding in the ruined and freezing nose of the aircraft, Joseph Sarnoski dragged himself back to his position, because the fighters were coming around again, and the nose of the bomber was the most vulnerable point, and someone had to defend it. He got back on the gun. He fired it. He hit another fighter as it bore in. And then, at his post, with his hands on his weapon and the enemy in his sights, he died. He was, by the accounts of the men who knew him, a quiet and kind person, not a warrior by temperament, a man who had joined up out of a sense of duty and wanted nothing more than to do his job well and go home to his family. What he did in the last moments of his life was not the act of a man in love with violence. It was the act of a man who would not leave his post while his crew was in danger, and it cost him everything. The last thing he did with his life was defend the airplane and the men in it. There is no way to improve on the plain facts of what Joseph Sarnoski did, and no need to try. A man with a mortal wound, who knew it was mortal, who was days from going home, spent the last strength of his life crawling toward the danger rather than away from it. He did it to work a gun in the ruined nose of a bomber, so that the enemy could not come through the front unopposed. He did not do it for glory, because he had no reason to expect to live long enough to receive any. He did it because the airplane needed the nose defended, and he was the man whose job that was. It is one of the purest acts of duty in the record of that war, and it was performed by a coal miner's son in the last few minutes of his life. Up in the cockpit, Jay Zeamer was fighting a different battle, and it was the one the whole mission depended on. He was badly wounded, the controls were damaged, the airplane was being torn at from every side, and every instinct he had, every reflex a pilot owns, screamed at him to throw the bomber into a violent evasive dive, to break away, to do something. And he could not. The mapping run was not finished. The cameras were still recording the beaches that thousands of men needed. So Jay Zeamer, bleeding from his arms and his legs, held old 66 straight and level, and finished the photographic run, flying his shattered aircraft in a rigid line through the middle of the fight that was killing his crew, because turning would have wasted everything they had already paid. Hold on to what that sentence actually describes, because it is easy to read past. A man is bleeding from wounds in his arms and his legs. His friend is dying a few feet away. His airplane is being hit again and again by cannon and machine gun fire. His instruments are shattered, and the wind is howling through the shattered nose. And every instinct he has, every hour of training, every animal reflex, is telling him to wrench the airplane out of that straight line and get away, and he does not do it. He holds the line through all of it, for however many seconds or minutes the camera still needs, because the map is not finished. That is not the courage of the charge. It is a colder and rarer thing, the courage to keep doing the calm, precise, deadly, boring work, while everything screams at you to run. Only when the run was complete, when the beaches were on film, did he finally throw the bomber into evasive action and begin the long fight to get home. And then the second ordeal began, because home was 600 miles away. The battle with the fighters went on for a long time. Some accounts say close to 40 minutes in all. The gunners of old 666 firing back from every position as the enemy made pass after pass. Eventually the fighters, low on fuel and ammunition, broke off and turned back toward their island, and left the wrecked bomber alone in the sky. The gunners had kept them off through the whole of it, working their weapons without pause as the fighters bored in again and again, and that too is part of why any of them lived. This was not one man's fight. It was the whole crew's, each gunner defending his own arc of the sky, the airplane turning its many guns in every direction as the attacks came in, so that a fighter lining up on the bomber from any angle met fire coming back. The heavily armed machine the eager beavers had built out of a wreck did exactly what they had built it to do, and it did it long enough for the enemy to run low and give up. But the price of those long minutes was written all over the airplane and all through its crew. What was left was an airplane that had no business staying in the air, and a pilot who had no business still flying it. The nose was blown open. There were more than 200 holes in the aircraft. 6 of the 9 men aboard were wounded, 1 was dead, and the pilot himself was bleeding from multiple wounds, drifting toward unconsciousness, with hundreds of miles of open ocean between him and any friendly field. Zeamer refused morphine, because morphine would have put him under, and he was the one flying the airplane. He stayed at the controls, conscious by willpower, for the hours it took to nurse that broken bomber back across the sea, and he brought it down safely at a field in New Guinea. He had lost so much blood that by the time they got him out of the airplane, some who saw him thought he was dead. The flight home is, in its own way, as remarkable as the fight, and it is often skipped over in the telling. Winning the battle over the target meant nothing if the airplane could not be brought back across 600 miles of ocean, and the man who had to bring it back was failing physically by the minute. To refuse morphine under those circumstances is a decision most people will never have to understand, choosing to remain in agonizing pain rather than dull it, because sleep would mean the airplane went into the sea and took the living and the dead with it. Zeamer made that choice and held to it for hours, flying by willpower over an empty ocean, until the coast of New Guinea finally came up ahead, and he could put the broken bomber down. Then, and only then, he let go. He was not dead. He would spend months in hospitals, and he would recover, and he would live a long life. But 9 men had flown out that morning, and one of them, Joseph Sarnoski, did not come home, and the photographs they had bled for went off to be developed. 6 of the survivors carried wounds out of that airplane. The aircraft itself was a ruin, its nose gone, its skin punched through in more than 200 places, a machine that by any reasonable measure should have come apart in the air, and instead had carried its crew home. It never flew a combat mission like that again. But it had done the one thing it was sent to do. In its cameras were the images of a coastline that an invasion would need, and those images had survived the battle intact, which meant that everything the crew had paid had bought something real. Here is how it unfolded, in order. Late on the 15th of June, 1943. Hours before takeoff, the crew is asked to add a run over the Buka airfield, and Zeamer twice objects that it will alert the enemy. 4 in the morning on the 16th. Old 666 takes off alone and flies 600 miles across open ocean toward Bougainville. After sunrise over the target, with the light too poor for the beach photographs, the crew votes to photograph Buka first and watches enemy fighters scramble to intercept them. The mapping run, Zeamer turns onto the 22-minute straight and level course over Bougainville rather than flee, and the fighters catch the bomber near the end of it. The first head-on pass. A cannon shell destroys the nose, mortally wounds Sarnoski, and badly wounds Zeamer, and Sarnoski crawls back to his gun, downs another fighter, and dies at his post. The flight home. Zeamer holds course to finish the photographs, then flies the wrecked bomber 600 miles back, refusing morphine to stay conscious, and lands it safely. The factors behind what this crew accomplished are worth naming plainly. The first factor was the airplane they had built. A wreck that nobody wanted, rebuilt by hand, and armed far beyond the normal standard, was the reason a lone bomber could fight off a swarm of fighters at all, instead of simply being shot out of the sky. The second factor was the decision to accept the trap. The mission required giving up every defense a bomber has for 22 minutes, and the crew flew it anyway, knowing exactly what they were surrendering. The third factor was the refusal to turn. At the moment the fighters struck, the easy and human thing was to break away and save the aircraft, and the entire value of the mission depended on not doing it, and they did not do it. Every other defensive measure a bomber has is an action a crew takes. This one was the opposite. It was an action deliberately not taken, a hand kept steady on the controls when every instinct demanded that it move. And that is a far harder discipline than it sounds. The fourth factor was simple endurance, a dying man crawling back to his gun, and a bleeding pilot holding a course and then holding consciousness across 600 miles of sea. Strip away the tail number and the medals, and what old 66 did comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. Courage in an airplane is usually imagined as aggression, as diving in and attacking, and the crew of old 66 had plenty of that kind on other days. But the courage that made this mission legendary was the exact opposite. It was the courage not to act, not to maneuver, not to save themselves. It was the courage to sit rigid and straight and level in the middle of a battle that was tearing the airplane apart. Because the one move that would have saved 9 men that morning would have killed hundreds of others on a beach in November. A bomber under attack wants to turn. Every nerve in the men flying it wants to turn. Old 666 refused to turn, and the refusal was the whole point. That refusal was paid back in full months later, and it is why this story matters beyond the courage of it. On the 1st of November, 1943, American Marines and soldiers went ashore at Empress Augusta Bay on the west coast of Bougainville, the very coast old 666 had mapped. Because of those photographs and the others like them, the men planning that landing knew where the reefs were and where the beaches would bear the weight of the landing craft. The information that Joseph Sarnoski died for, and that Jay Zeamer nearly died for, was in the hands of the men who needed it. That is the quiet, unglamorous payoff that reconnaissance work almost never gets credit for. No one cheers a photograph. There are no headlines for a map of a reef. But the men who came ashore at Empress Augusta Bay came ashore knowing where the water would betray them and where it would hold. Some unknown number of them walked up that beach alive because of it, never knowing the names of the 2 men who had brought them that knowledge months before over the same coast. The straight line those 2 held through the fire became, in the end, thousands of men reaching a beach alive. There is a detail about the timing of the awards that is worth knowing. The Medal of Honor is not given quickly or easily. It is investigated, reviewed, weighed, and often it is downgraded to a lesser decoration along the way. For a single mission to produce 2 of them is almost beyond precedent, and it happened here because what these 2 men did was so clearly, so unarguably, at the very top of what the award exists to recognize. The system that had never quite known what to do with Jay Zeamer, that had failed him on check ride after check ride, ended by giving him and his friend the highest honor the nation possesses. For what they did on the 16th of June, both men received the Medal of Honor, the highest award the United States gives. Sarnoski's was posthumous, awarded to a bombardier who had crawled back to his gun to die defending his crew. Zeamer's was pinned on a man who had held his course through his own wounds and then flown a ruined bomber home. The award citations describe the actions in the flat, formal language of the military record. But behind that language is a plain fact. These 2 friends, who had gone looking for a fight together in an airplane nobody else wanted, had performed on the same morning 2 of the most extraordinary acts of the entire air war. It is the only mission in the entire Second World War for which 2 men were awarded the Medal of Honor. Every other member of that crew received the Distinguished Service Cross. That made the eager Beavers, this collection of misfits nobody else had wanted, the most decorated single crew in American history. Jay Zeamer recovered, though it took a very long time and many operations. He lived on for more than 60 years, married, raised a family, worked as an engineer, and by every account did not go through life presenting himself as a hero or trading on what he had done. He became, in his later years, the longest surviving Medal of Honor recipient of the Army Air Forces from that war, a living link to a morning over Bougainville that fewer and fewer people remembered. He died in 2007, and he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among the nation's honored dead, an old man who had once been the young captain nobody in the peacetime system had been able to place. Joseph Sarnoski, the coal miner's son who had been days from going home, was buried, and a mountain of official paper and a lifetime of gratitude could not give his family back the gentle man who had chosen, in his last minutes, to crawl toward the enemy rather than away. It is worth remembering, too, that these were not professional adventurers or men with nothing to lose. They were, most of them, young men who had been civilians a couple of years earlier, who had families and homes and plans, and who wanted very much to survive the war and go back to them. Sarnoski was days from doing exactly that. What they did over Bougainville they did not because they were reckless with their lives, but because in the moment the mission and the men beside them mattered more. That is what makes it worth telling. There is a way of remembering this war as a thing of vast fleets and thousand plane raids and the movement of armies across continents, and all of that is true. But it was also won in pieces this small, by 9 men in an airplane nobody wanted, holding a line they were not allowed to leave, so that men they would never meet could walk onto a beach and live. The photographs came home. The line held. That was the mission, and they did not turn. A crew of misfits in a cast-off bomber flew into the deadliest sky in the Pacific and held a course they were forbidden to leave. They paid for it, so that the record would show what one crew could do when it decided the job was worth more than its own survival. If there is a single image to carry away from this one, let it be that straight line drawn across the sky over Bougainville. It was held steady through the middle of a battle by a bleeding man at the controls, while a swarm of fighters did everything they could to make him swerve. Every reason in the world said to break that line. One reason said to hold it, and the reason was a beach full of men who did not yet know they would need it, months in the future, whose names Jay Zeamer and Joseph Sarnoski would never learn. They held the line for strangers. That is as good a description of what those men did as any, and it is worth more than any count of enemy fighters ever could be. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. The famous battles and the small, almost forgotten acts of ordinary men that decided them, without the myths and without the easy exaggeration. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches more people who should know what the crew of Old 66 did. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next one.